A Russian tank, that Shadow, and a fellow Canadian, the sniper known as Wally, had been quietly stalking in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, turned and fired on them. Two Ukrainian soldiers who were with them had ignored Wally's advice a moment before by stepping outside the cover of their observation post, nothing more than a trench for a cigarette. Shadow, a former Canadian soldier from Sherbrooke, a member of the Royal 22nd Regiment who later served as a meteorological technician with the Navy, had been about to join his Ukrainian friends when the tank opened up, landing a shell right between the two Ukrainians. Shadow was blown back to the trench, his ears ringing from the explosion. He crawled up, poked his head outside, and was greeted by a scene of utter carnage. One of the men had died instantly. The second Ukrainian soldier was still alive, but barely. And then this is a quote. He was like just a couple of feet from me and still breathing, but no legs, Shadow told CBC News Thursday in an interview in Lviv in western Ukraine. And then we made eye contact. I looked at him, he looked at me. It took a couple of moments for the soldier to die. And then the CBC also says Wally, a fellow Vandu and sniper with combat experience in Afghanistan, was maneuvering around to get a clean shot at one of the Russian Iron Monsters with an American-made Javelin anti-armor missile. The tank had been tantalizingly out of reach before it turned on them and struck. This guy, Shadow, he noted in the interview, the video interview, that the Russian tank fire was extremely precise. Here's the thing. This is not Iraq 2003, where the Iraqis were using old export versions of Soviet tanks. These are newer tanks. Even if they're the T-72s, most of them have infrared sights on them. They have computerized fire control, modern fire control. And yes, they can see you day or night, and they can hit you very precisely. And this is what they're going up against. When the Western media says that the Russians are incompetent, they're bungling, they can't do even the most basic military operation, that's war propaganda. Shadow here is telling you that they can't even get in range with a javelin, and these things are picking them off with a high degree of precision. This is a Westerner talking to the Western media in safe territory. He's not a Russian prisoner of war trying to flatter his captors. Now, before he went to the Donbas region, this all happened in the Donbas, the Eastern Front. He was in Irpin near Kiev, and he was also with Wally, and he was assisting him with ammunition. And in Irpin, they actually ended up running from the Russians. They were just completely overwhelmed by the amount of firepower brought down on them. It was tanks, I do believe he said also rifle fire. And then the CBC was asking him, what do you think about Canada's response to all of this? And he said, and the West in general, and he says he's equally skeptical of the West's approach going forward. What Ukraine needs, he said, are boots on the ground. And this shows you how utterly disconnected from reality these guys are. He completely misunderstood, underestimated, had no idea about the situation in Ukraine before he went. And he was shocked into reality to the point where he left the fighting. He won't do it anymore. And even at this point where he has been faced with the consequences of his ignorance, he's still going to keep talking instead of just stopping and admitting he knows nothing and he needs to go back to zero and build an understanding of this conflict. And this goes for Wally also. I'll get into that in just a minute, but just think about if NATO puts boots on the ground in Ukraine, what happens then? I mean, did this guy think that through? No, he doesn't think anything through. That's why he was dodging tank shells in Donbas with absolutely no chance of winning. As a matter of fact, let's talk about Wally here real quick. I'm jumping out of order here, but there's this article here. This is another article about Wally. Wally's third war, the Canadian sniper who could not say no to Ukraine. And it says right here, Wally says that he did not have in-depth knowledge about the conflict, but felt that action was necessary. Not everything is black and white, but what we saw was a large-scale aggression, he said. He does not have in-depth knowledge of the conflict. He admits that, and yet he's going to go there armed, potentially kill people. It turns out he killed no one, but potentially to kill people in a conflict that you have no in-depth knowledge of. Does that sound like a smart thing to do or the right thing to do? No, but this is what Western media turns people into. The people who are receptive to it and the people who don't question it, this is what ends up happening. They become a danger to themselves and others. Now, Wally was part of this Norman Brigade, and we saw in that first CBC article, at that time it was called Norman Group, but then it turned into a brigade, which is funny. I mean, there's only 30 guys and it should be called Norman Platoon at best. But it says, this is the National Post, it says, incompetence or the realities of war, turmoil for Canadian-led foreign battalion in Ukraine. And the links to all of these very interesting articles will be in the video description below. So this Norman Brigade is led by a Canadian. He's living in Ukraine. He has a family. His wife is Ukrainian. He has kids. And he decided to do, I guess, the Norman Group first, which was supposed to be a charity, and then he started getting into the military side of things. To build up his brigade, he's recruiting, mostly Canadians, but also other Westerners to join him. And he's kind of siphoning them off from what I guess would normally go into whatever Ukraine's official foreign legion is. And when they get there, they're in like drafty basements and everyone is getting sick. They said there's 30 guys, but they have weapons for only 7 or 8 of them. They've got, 30 to 60 bullets per person. And as I've explained before, a full loadout, at least for like a U.S. soldier or Marine, is 210 rounds. And that'll barely get you through a firefight, if even. Sometimes not even. And so these guys had only 30 to 60 bullets per person. This puts you in danger because you think you're armed and you go into a firefight and you have not nearly enough equipment to sustain yourself in even a basic firefight. And so the whole reason for this article is that many former members of this brigade are complaining about how incompetent the leader is, how poorly equipped it was. So they interview Wally, who was a member of this brigade at one point, and he says, the Norman Brigade was equipped the same way as many Ukrainian units, the sniper said. That means that many things Westerners take for granted are not available. That includes protective equipment, medical supplies, weapons, ammunition. This is what I've been saying every single update about Ukraine, that they're out of weapons, they're out of bullets. The West cannot send it fast enough. Ukraine doesn't have factories that make it. It's not going to happen. It's not something that you can make up for in a couple of months or even a year. It will take a very long time to do this. There's also another interesting thing. We always keep hearing about how Nazis in Ukraine is imagined by Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. But as a matter of fact, the National Post, in its article, it says at one point they discovered that Hroff, the guy leading the Norman Brigade, had a tattoo on his hand of a black sun, a symbol used by the SS in Nazi Germany and sometimes by the neo-fascist movement. Paul and John recall two people that this article was interviewing. My friend James, who was there, literally spat on the ground in front of him and said, this is everything our grandfathers fought against in the Second World War. Do these people realize that the Azov Battalion literally operates under a Nazi flag? I wonder if they know that and if they would spit in front of the Azov Battalion, who are trapped in Mariupol, but also have factions operating all across the country. So I just thought this article was interesting. It also illustrates the infighting within the group and also fighting between them and other factions over the limited resources that Ukraine has. And again, this is very similar to the situation in Syria, where you had all these armed groups fighting. It was not a single military that they could stand up, just because the nature of what it was they were trying to do. They could not stand up an entire unified army. They could only stand up all of these different groups. They had different ideologies. They were all competing for resources. They were just as likely to kill each other as they were to go fight the Syrian Arab army and their allies. And this is happening in Ukraine right now, where you have these factions fighting with each other while also trying to fight with the Russians. And the Russians are mainly a cohesive standing army. And the grand finale. This is Le Presse. This is French language Canadian media. I suppose it's actually quite large. You can translate this through your browser or through the translation tool of your choice, and read through it. It's very interesting, and it kind of follows the same theme. So in this Le Presse interview with Wally, upon returning to Canada, he recounts the death of those two Ukrainians that I was just talking about in the interview with Shadow, while they were attempting, or I should say failing, to hunt Russian tanks. He returned to Canada after that experience in the Donbas region. He had, at the very beginning, joined that Norman Brigade that I was just talking about, and he notes the lack of weapons and equipment. And he left the Norman Brigade to join Ukraine's official Foreign Legion, but even there, he couldn't find weapons, he couldn't find ammunition, he couldn't even find food. And I don't know if you saw that picture. Let's see if I can find it. He's talking about how they couldn't find food. There's him with the javelin. And they end up actually eating Russian rations that they found because they can't produce their own food. They cannot source their own food.
So anyways, Red Pill Scholar comment. Well, I am a former US soldier, so I will tell you that I do understand what this guy went through. Overseas in Afghanistan or Iraq, we were fighting basically peasants with home-built explosive devices, AK-47s, light machine guns, or whatever they could come up with. We had a complete air superiority, complete and near-perfect artillery support. Now he actually deployed himself to a place where he became the underdog. He fought in Afghanistan. As soon as his feet hit the ground, no air coverage or support to speak of, no artillery support or very little of it to speak of, and terrible leadership. Compared to complete air superiority for the Russians, as well as their massive and extremely accurate artillery and counter-battery fire, supporting the well-led, well-equipped and trained Russian professional army. The rest, as they say, is history. When he saw what he was really up against, he got what we in America like to call a reality check. Quietly snuck away and got the hell out of there as fast as his feet would carry him. And he was attacked by many Ukrainian bots for simply saying the truth. Anonymous. Comment. I'm from Slovenia. From the start of this conflict in the end of February 22, start was in quotes, I thought it was weird how the reporting was so one-sided. Evil Putin attacked Ukraine out of nowhere and nobody knew why. He was talking about some Nazis and stuff like that, which was just bizarre. What was weird to me was how nobody wanted to really get down into the why, which I always thought reporters were there to investigate. It all quickly went down the path of sanctions, and pretty soon nobody in the media seemed to care about why anymore. Back then I knew nothing about this conflict, but it sent me down the path of wanting to know. I started wanting to know what the enemy had to say about this conflict. But it became very hard, as Putin and any of his speeches became pretty much impossible to see on mainstream media in the West. The best we could get were reporters in the media explaining what he said and putting things in context for us. I thought that was bizarre too, and even though he was supposed to be the enemy. Censorship is never the right way, right? And coming from the liberal Western media, I thought it smelled so much fishier. This led me look up Russian state media for the first time, and I found TASS. For a while I was regularly checking news from our sources and the TASS, as to get at least a glimpse of what the eastern side of this horrible mess of a conflict was perceiving to be about. Eventually I started understanding their perspective a bit, although I was still skeptical as to the validity of their claims. They were still too preposterous. A while after, I stumbled upon people like Brian Berletic and Patrick Lancaster. I think I'm only now starting to see that while we pride ourselves as being so free, liberal, and tolerant, it's not really that simple, is it? We keep hearing how China is screwing everybody over in trade and IP, genociding their own people, cutting people's freedom, etc., Putin, the evil dictator, starting a warpath to conquering Europe, everybody guessing where he'll go after Ukraine. Maybe Moldova, Transnistria, then who knows, etc. I'm starting to see how now that nobody really cares about Ukraine anyway. I don't think Zelensky really does, because the alternative is that he is grossly incompetent. If he cared, he wouldn't be pushing his country and his people toward bankruptcy through all the weapons deals that his people will be paying for the next 30 years. Whether they win or lose, if he cared, he would put a stop to the likes of Azov Battalion if he had any integrity. To give him props, though, he knows how to rally the West behind him. It doesn't take much. You just have to hint at the idea that West might be scared of Putin, and they'll send you anything you ask. Of course we aren't scared, what a joke. As I try not to believe that he doesn't care, though, the only other conclusion I can come to is that he's incompetent. The West also doesn't care. If they did, they would forgive the debts that Ukraine has towards world banks and other nations, not send more loaned weapons that they will pay for in billions. As it stands, we the Westerners are just pushing Ukraine towards more and more poverty. Aren't we the good guys? The European Union also doesn't care about anyone, with one exception though. Somebody has to wipe the ass of the US. That's us. We are here to kneel and do whatever the US and Great Britain decide for us, because we are incapable of deciding for ourselves. We will punish the Russians for what they are doing, because that is the only way to stop this conflict. We will crush their economy, take away their livelihoods, the extent that we can take away their stuff, which reminds me of, dare I say, communism in Yugoslavia era. They cannot come to visit us, and this is all because of Putin. That's not us doing anything, that's all Putin. If you want someone to point your finger at, well, that's the culprit. The only two guys I hear that have the courage to state their true opinions, however unpopular, are Lukashenko, Belarus, and Viktor Orban, Hungary. Kudos to those guys. I want the war to stop. That should be obvious. That's everything everybody really wants. But our response to it, with all the senseless sanctions punishing ordinary civilians appropriating people's property just because they are rich and from a country led by a person we currently don't like is no way forward. It actually seems to me like in the past 3 months we have actually degraded relationships between our countries for at least 30 years. What a shame. But I guess that's how it'll go on. Putin will remain the evil guy. We will remain the good guys protecting an innocent invaded country. US will keep selling weapons in the name of freedom. And the rest of us will simply watch because nobody gives about what we think anyways. My heart is broken. Still, it goes out to all the dead civilians and their families. All the families who lost their homes. All the Russians whose culture is being blocked simply because they exist. I hope some days these walls between our cultures will be torn down and we can be friends again. I can hardly wait for that day to come. Peace. Daniel Harris. I'm a former American soldier myself, and I'm apparently a Russia bot because I know what's really going, and I don't live in a world of make-believe. A lot of people didn't expect real artillery, they thought it was Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. They have no idea what a slow methodical advance is, and even less of how the Russians tend to fight despite all the evidence from Syria, etc. Facts, I'm from New Zealand and I'm apparently a bot also. Yep, OCX infantry here and same with me. What an insane world we live in these days. Feels like I'm in an episode of Black Mirror. Yeah, I'm a former US Army artillery forward observer combat veteran who is actually a bot too. It's been obvious to me that Russia is mopping the floor in Ukraine and have been from the beginning. It's a shame and a crime that NATO and particularly the US is promoting and supporting this war. Actually, it's tragic. My hope is that the Russian army will complete this operation quickly. It seems that only Russian victory will save innocent lives. As for the Ukrainian Nazis, I'm confident that Mother Russia has an appropriate solution for them. I was accused of being a Russian bot. I'm Mexican-American living in Costa Rica. Living in the countryside is Pura Vida. Excellent information, Brian Barletic. We don't get fooled like most people. God bless you. German army vets here, also a Putin bot, apparently. This conflict has been on my radar for years. It's really a badge of honor now. If those idiots don't like us, then we are definitely doing something right. Enjoy life and stay safe. Same here, I'm a Moscow bot now. Yeah, UK infantry bot here. I need to do my research, I'm obsolete now. Robots are the thing today, of course. I need to learn to code. I was in Kosovo. Apparently I'm a communist bot too. Daniel, I have family members and close personal friends who served with the 175th and 502 2nd Army Rangers Bridge Infantry units, and when on leave they would always play paintball war games with me while I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. We would always talk about actual battles, tactics, and strategy and throughout world history, and it's very sad that people actually think a $6 billion military can actually beat a $62 billion military. Yes, I'm also called a bot or a troll, usually by persons with fake names and all. They never engage in serious dialogue. You can imagine what they are in real life. Russian bot all the way from Northeast India. Victory to Russia. Ura. Exactly, anybody who thinks for themselves and not go with the crowd, you're labeled a bot. It's crazy. I'm Danish and definitely a Russian bot. Link them all this video, tell them they're hero, the best sniper, the bot said all this himself, the actual Nazis, the lack of supplies and ammunition, the infighting between factions, all of it said by him. So anyways, what I wanted to say is that disgusting, repulsive freak that messaged me some weekends ago, I'll be angry for months to come, because I never forget the shit that was totally uncalled for. And now I will be revenging that disgusting, repulsive freak. So, back in the day, he played his game on me, where I asked for help, I asked for investigation, and I guess he planned on trafficking me in the third militant country, which was not Australia, in order to put me, I guess, into permanent coma, artificial sleep, and then drain my blood and extract my eggs monthly so that they could have their immunity to the poison that they poison with. And exactly, I don't care about all this military stuff, but now I will be revenging them quite well.